Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of All Things Autism by Court One. My name is Anisha Ravel, and I'm one of your co hosts and a co founder of Court One.
I'm Manav Ravel, the other co-host and co-founder of Court One. We're thrilled to kick off this podcast series where we'll explore different aspects of autism spectrum disorder, discuss challenges, and celebrate accomplishments within the community.
Hi, I'm Shashir, and I'll be joining in to ask some key questions today. I'm really excited to dive into the topic of misconceptions about autism and learn more alongside all of you.
Hi, I'm Niyati. Also here to ask a couple questions. I can't wait to discuss how we as individuals and communities can break down stereotypes and create a more inclusive world.
For our first episode, we have an incredible guest joining us. Please welcome Gina Bannevich, the Executive Director of the Golden Key School for Exceptional Children in Canton, Ohio. Gina, thank you so much for being here with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a part of your inaugural podcast. This is great. Thank you.
That's great to hear, and thank you so much for being here today. We're glad to have you here to share your knowledge and experiences. Let's dive right into today's topic, which is common misconceptions about autism.
Okay.
But before we start, it's important to acknowledge that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention notes that 1 in 36 children have autism.
So, one common misconception about autism is that individuals on the spectrum don't experience emotions the same way as others. So, where do you think this idea originated from? And can we educate people about the emotional depth of individuals with autism?
Absolutely. I can provide you my educated guess with a full knowledge of anything that I have in front of me. But years and years ago, autism was known as the cold disorder. If you do your research, you'll learn that it was from sadly the French that indicated that they did not show emotions to their children, and it resulted in this lack thereof emotion because those with the diagnosis of autism, in my opinion, in those very early years, were those most impacted. So those most impacted have, different abilities still, I will say it numerous times probably throughout, this conversation, that when you meet one person on the spectrum, you only meet one person because it is so dynamic and so unique to each person, because that leads to the research that you all are supporting, that's what makes it so tricky to figure out all those the who, what, when, and where questions, right? But that lack of emotion, I feel, comes from this socially stereotypical presentation of what autism looks like. The thing about autism, there is no true face to autism. You don't know somebody could have that, quote, label on them, but appear to be just as, typical as any one of us. So it is hard to tell a story when you don't have, we have physical challenged individuals in wheelchairs. They tell a story. You have disorders that have, facial discrepancies. You have, cancer that, oftentimes you lose your hair. So there's things that, can tell so many people about what's going on in you by look and appearance. Autism isn't that simple. So sure, there are individuals that have, maybe appear to look, a little bit different than the next person. But when it comes to, all, it is not the same. And so I think that goes with that lack of emotion on top of it.
Yeah, and I really feel like understanding those differences in expression really helps with understanding autism. Because if people start confusing these differences in expression with a lack of emotion, like you said, that's where the misconception and the stereotypes really come in. And I feel like by better understanding those differences, we can really build stronger connections with individuals on the spectrum.
Absolutely. I think that's a struggle for those on the spectrum too, that are those that society would call higher functioning, because when they give those dry answers or those responses with lack of emotion to us, who know how to read a room, know how to provide, inflection in our speech in the right spots, they don't, and so then they're taken as rude or don't mind your feelings, so that is where we as a society need to become open in understanding that not everybody emotes the same way nor expresses the same way, however we speak. There's 5 of us here, and each one of us have a different way we speak, a different way we show emotion. And then add into it, if one of us was on the spectrum, having to first, that person would have to observe what's going on, and that's a very difficult, it's one of those core deficits within autism. And then understand what's socially appropriately in that response, again, a core deficit. Language, you got your social, and then what's the reaction to that? My behavior is going to somewhat be affected by that. And if we as a society don't understand that that person has to struggle, then we just write them off as rude or insensitive or whatever the case may be. So
Exactly. And I think it's really important, going off of what you said, to challenge assumptions like that. And I think that most people need to understand that they need to meet people where they are, instead of imposing our own ideas of how emotions should look and basically following the natural stereotype or stigma that is surrounded by that, and instead accepting people for who they are.
So, building on that, what are some ways families or caregivers can support individuals with autism in expressing their emotions and really figuring out how to find that balance?
So I think it's difficult because I think understanding where a person is coming from and hearing what they're requesting a little bit more, and being more open to getting a response that you're not comfortable with, in a world when you have as a parent, when you get a diagnosis. So I think from that caregiver, from the fellow family members, trying to just see where that person is and where you need to meet them. So no different than how, when you guys are heading into finals weeks, how do you handle the final versus how does he handle the final? And we all need different things. So, being open to hearing what I need from you and being okay with it, not necessarily being what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, of course. Those are some really good points. I think it's important to acknowledge that empathy is one of the strongest parts of caregiving, and that's something that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea of creating these safe or more caring spaces is an incredibly important point because when people feel comfortable, they're naturally more open to expressing their own beliefs, their opinions, but overall their identity in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the world that we need to keep moving toward, is providing safe places. It's wonderful that, the zoos, the malls, the arenas, they all have those quiet rooms. They have accessibility, with the headphones and such like that. But, there's part, we hear it time and time again. There's the awareness, there's the acceptance, and then there's the ability to educate and understand that all those things are there to support them, just like a ramp is available for somebody in a wheelchair. So it shouldn't necessarily exclude, but include. And that's the biggest piece that, again, we have to work through when it comes to that. Empathy is not a natural thing for many, but then having to understand that you have to make the next step in that empathetic approach when it comes to somebody with a disorder.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for mentioning that. There's also this idea that individuals on the spectrum are either skilled in areas like math or art, or that they struggle greatly in almost everything that they do. Why do you think that this misconception persists, and what's the reality for most individuals on the spectrum?
I mean, many years ago when I was in college, I was studying communications. And one of the things that was the big question was, does life imitate art, or does art imitate life? Did the movie tell a story about something that happened in life, or is a movie preparing you for what's going to happen in life? So obviously it's 6 and 1/2 dozen. But I feel, again, it's the squeaky wheel concept. The person that you see out there most, frequently is that person, again, that can tell a story without using words. And right now I think about when I have a son on the spectrum. He would appear in our podcast here today as somebody who looks just like any one of us, and he would have his quirks here or there, but for the most part, you would never guess that he is somebody that is impacted in any way. But when we first learned his diagnosis 16 years ago, only thing out at that point was obviously Rain Man, and then Parenthood, a TV show that was out years ago, and it had a person on the spectrum, and it was a really hard. I could everybody be like, oh, you have to watch Parenthood. I don't know how many people told me, go watch Parenthood so you can understand autism, because there's a character on that would not have helped me, because that's not who my son is either. And it's, and one, my son was 3 at the time. So that really wouldn't have helped me for a teenage boy on the TV show. And then even now, as we go and we see, the shows such as Love on the Spectrum or Atypical and all those different shows. And it takes me quite some time before I would ever sit down and watch them, because again, it is what I feel the media is trying to tell you what is for everyone, but it's not. It is not. One of the biggest things my son was like, I just would love to have a girlfriend. I would love to have a friend that in here, Love on the Spectrum, you watch that show, it's a great show. I think it's very well done, but they don't show you all the clips and the pieces behind the scene that makes it hard for somebody to really go through those social approaches, such as trying to date, and then, before we were talking about that picky eating concept. How is he going to go on a date when he is such a picky eater? But they don't show, and that's those things that make it really hard. And truly, honestly, I feel that the misconceptions come from those media pieces that are out there, that have far more frequency than 131 kids that are sitting in my building that are all very different.
Yeah, and exactly. Your point about like the amount of differences in these like different people, because everybody has a different way of expressing themselves. And I know the media doesn't acknowledge that the spectrum is so wide, and it really is unfair to put everybody in the same box, which is why misconceptions like these exist.
Right.
Highlighting those individual differences can really help shift how people think about autism, and maybe incorporating the fact that there's a spectrum in the media is really what can make the biggest difference.
I would absolutely agree. That's definitely it.
It's also a reminder to focus on each person's unique strengths rather than just what fits into a stereotype, which is why I think our next question should be, how do you feel the media has influenced the public's perception of autism? And are there any examples where the media has either helped or harmed understanding?
Sure. Oh, I think the media drives so much. I mean, I was a studier of communication and media, and still this day, it fascinates me how much the media drives, every little bit. And it's so much more dynamic than it was in the mid 90s when I was studying it, because, I went from when I studied marketing and communications, you had 9 to 10 frequencies that needed to impact for a marketing message. And now we're into thousands in one day. For you to make a difference, you have to tell your brand 1,000 times. So then on top of it, when you have, people out there who profess that they're experts, everybody's an expert on TikTok for one thing or another, but how are they? What is their expertise? What's the degree behind them, or what's their experience behind them? My favorite are the people that are, in physically good shape, in if you look at them, you see that, then you assume that they know how to do all the exercises correctly. Well, the same goes with the media. If you keep showing this one line of the spectrum, then that must be the only line, and we all seem to believe that, versus believing that there is differences in intricacies to every person. And think about what you're part of, like, what was the positive and what's the negative that I've seen. I would say one of the most negative things that I saw, and this was way back, and you all were pretty young, but when the Newton shooting occurred in 2014, I believe it was, the individual that did the shooting, there was a lot of talk at one point, anyone, sadly, I feel, has a cry for help if they're doing those type of things. But one of the things was like, oh, he's on the spectrum, that is why he did that. That was crushing, 10, 11 years ago almost. And, Actually, it's been just 10 years this December. And, to think that then now everybody was going to believe if you had a spectrum diagnosis, could you then be somebody who's going to go shoot up a school? So that was probably the most impactful media for the negative. And I'm really struggling to find positives. And media is so different now. We do streaming. Not one of us really, I should say, not one of us. Many of us don't have cable, anymore to turn on your regular TV at 8 o'clock and watch those shows and so on. But I will say, I am very impressed with Love on the Spectrum. I feel that that show does show lots of the pieces and parts to the differences, since they show so many different individuals. So I would say that is a positive approach. It's a step forward. Do we have a lot out there to look at? No, not within the media.
It's frustrating when the media reduces complex experiences into one-dimensional portrayals. And I really appreciated how you mentioned the media's attempt to simplify almost everything into just one generic category and how that can really influence public perception. But you also did a great job mentioning how there's also times where the media has done it right, so it provides us a little bit of hope for the future.
Uh-huh. The
And
things that you all are doing make it hope for the future. So.
Oh,
yeah. And I think that the media has so much power to shape public opinion. So oversimplification of ASD is definitely not the solution here. So the more accurate stories we tell, the better informed overall we as a society can be. So exactly.
okay. How can high schoolers and college students help stop the spread of misinformation about autism spectrum disorder?
Cool. That's a hard one. I, I think being accepting, doing things such as, again, what you all are doing, being, more understanding when they see, a fellow, student doing something a little bit, maybe quirky or weird, as we say in my household a lot, we'll say, that's weird, don't do that, but understand that sometimes it can't be controlled. My son is what we call a hopper. It's for him to regulate. He hops in place, or will pace based on it. And he's very clear and very cognizant that it does look weird. So he works so hard to not do it at school. And then when he holds that in, but then also at the same time, he's also trying to learn and pay attention, that regulation starts to kind of break down. And he's mastered it now. He's a junior. And so he's mastering how to manage that, just as we all learn how to regulate our emotions. But it comes down to where, in the end, can people just understand, oh, that is his, no picking on, there's been countless times that my son's been bullied from school just simply because his way to regulate is not acceptable, and it looks weird. So I think from that college student, I think college students have a little bit more ability because they're starting to mature, and they're matriculating into a way, to understand that the world is different. That's what college is all about. It's presenting you different, dynamics, different cultural backgrounds. It's not just everybody from the same community as it is in a high school setting. So I think that it lends itself to be more acceptable in a college setting than it is in a high school setting, just simply because of the maturity factor. And then, that high school setting, how can you do, you see the kids sitting alone, you see them, making those approaches, to say, hey, what do you have there? And you talked about, they have a tendency to be believed to be really good at math or really good artists. Hey, what are you drawing? That's something I'm interested in. And again, with this type of question, I do, think back to hear the words of my son, and he, is always like, I just don't know how to start conversations with people. Like, I don't know how to interject myself. He's even in a club that is probably mostly people that have exceptionalities to them, but he still doesn't even know and feel comfortable with a group of individuals that are probably more like him than not to approach a conversation. So how do you make your circles more approachable is the biggest thing.
Exactly. So I think that's a really good idea that you shared. And it is much more difficult to do that in high school because of less opportunity. So I think it's more acceptable in college to have more opportunity to take that first initiative, that first step. But I agree, like it would be great to have that opportunity in high school as well. So I think that it's something that all of us can start doing soon.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And like going off of that, is there any specific ways that you suggest that schools, like you said, high schools don't really have that next step to take initiative, but how do you think that schools can play a bigger role in educating students about autism and really breaking down the misconceptions that we've talked about?
Well, you know, obviously working for a school, I understand the limitations that they have from, there's curriculum pieces that, every school has to meet, and there's requirements every school has to meet. But I do go back to when we integrated my son into the district. And one of the biggest things that I was adamant about is that during Autism Awareness Month, which is in April, that he shared a book, read a book about himself, and it was, for me, I feel it's no different than how we are working to embrace the LGBT community, or how we're looking to embrace people of color, so, and it should be more of, why do we have to make those extra steps for all those different differences? And then it should just be a part of it, and, to put it onto the schools, it's funny. When my daughter was in a health class, well, I forget whether it was her freshman year or her 8th grade year, she talked about the section. She came home, it's like, oh, we had class today was on autism spectrum. And I said, yeah, and she volunteers here. She's very much involved. I foresee her being an intervention specialist one day. She's very compassionate to those, that she sees need support. And she said, yeah, they touched this much on it, Mom. And I even had to correct the teacher. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope you corrected them correctly. Like, and not one of your assumptions, whatever. And then I hope you did it respectfully as well. But, and it is because, again, just like we said, people aren't truly educated on it. And just because it's in the book to teach about doesn't mean that the person teaching even understands what they're teaching. So
Yeah, and
it's hard from school.
100%. I like that's something I feel like we as Court One, that's part of our mission. And I feel like, you know, we have a reach, we have the privilege of talking to people from different schools, different states, different environments. And, like you said, teaching accurately. I feel like that's something that we can really do and expand reach across our schools. Maybe like a campaign or something that truly achieves that goal of accurately spreading awareness about autism rather than previous misconceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, schools are a really good place to start since kids are often carry on what they learn early into other stages. But obviously, as you said, college is a place where development is fostered. So, going along with that learning, what are some ways that we can promote better understanding of autism, especially in underrepresented communities where access to information has been proven to be really limited?
Oh, you're asking the tough questions today, guys. But I mean, I think that's the age-old question when it comes to every April, we hear it in our world, in our community of autism, what's the symbol that represents us? How do we get represented? How do we do this? How do we do this for them? But can we involve them into the conversation? Like, how do we include them in the conversation to share what would be the best way? As we look at, the High Department of Education and Workforce has had a complete overhaul in how they are looking at things. Well, are they including somebody that is on the spectrum, and B, somebody who can educate and is certified in manners of which that they have an expertise in working with somebody educationally on the spectrum? So those are the things, that's, the whole part of, critical theory and thinking is that how deep can you go, and are you having the right people at the table? And we're saying, how like at college you have an easier, there's more of an approach, but yet you're still in a world that it is not acceptable, to just be like, okay, come on into my world. Adulthood is not easy. So, and people are always open. So it's going to take, yes, us as neurotypicals asking questions and how we can do, but it's going to have to take us involving those non-neurotypical into the conversation to find out what is appropriate. Just like we ask African Americans, what's the best way to teach African American history? So those are the things. Think about all of our cultural differences that we have. We're asking our parents, where did we come from? How do we do this? So we're asking those that had the actual experience. So asking somebody on the spectrum, what's the actual experience you're having, and how do we change it, make it better, or keep making it good for you?
And I think that understanding that, just as like as you communicated, we ask people that are in the LGBTQ plus community, we ask these people who are people of color, like, what can we do for them? That's the same thing. And these like children, especially, they have thoughts and feelings. And so respecting and honoring those moving forward is something very productive. Um, I think that partnerships with local organizations are key for this, because they already have relationships in the community and can help spread the word effectively.
Right. I think, I think at an early age, we're often taught not to stare, right? I mean, you're taught not to stare at the kid in the wheelchair. You're taught not to stare at the kid hopping. You're taught not to stare at the only Black person in the room, right? And if we would stop that and say, answer the questions of those innocent minds of, when you're doing those things, when you are staring, when you are, trying to understand why is that person in a chair, being honest and teaching your next young, minds to say, oh, that person has, disability. Let's go ask them why they're in a chair, and not being afraid. I think that's so, a part of it. Like even watching, my son again, like, where I'll say, he says, I don't know how to approach, but if somebody approaches him, he's so on the defense because of the amount of bullying that he's experienced, or the questions that he's like, why does this person really want to talk to me? They must want something from me, or they are ready to do something to me. So he's on that defense. So then his snap is, what, so he isn't very approachable, and then that person that is trying to make the approach in involving him has then shut down because they're like, oh, that wasn't comfortable. So again, it is, there's so much that needs to be done that it's almost like a vicious cycle right now. So, and it's not going to change unless we as a society change on so many more fronts, not just from the autism spectrum world.
I think that's a great takeaway. And as we stated earlier, I think that empathy really is the foundation of like any effort to do all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, and conversations like this are a great way to start. It's all about building awareness step by step and really taking our time to build, everything that we've mentioned, debunking these myths and misconceptions and bringing the reality to the world.
So just because we're starting to wrap things up, we want to know more about you. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to specialize in working with individuals with autism?
Wow. Sure. I was never planning. This is my life. I was on a wonderful path, professionally to, move to a vice president of marketing in a corporation was a personal goal. Knew where that was going to take me in my mind, I guess. But also was a family person. I'm not from Stark County. I live in Tuscarawas. I was born and raised in Tuscarawas County, and very close to family, a very tight-knit Italian Catholic family. So always driven by both family and faith. And so I took that. And when my husband and I had our first son, we recognized through the support of others in our life, my parents, his parents, friends in the intervention world, started to notice that my son had, some unique weirdness, the best word I can put out there, and we say it to him, that was not common. And then it came with behaviors, and it came with the picky eating, it came with, all kinds of things. And then he was kicked out of numerous daycares at the time because he wasn't compliant. He didn't sit at circle time appropriately. He didn't always want to participate, but always knew the answer. Ironically, I always knew the answer, but wanted to sit under the table and play with the train. We'll really look at how the train worked. But so once he got released from his second childcare, I connected with a old friend, and that friend knew of the Golden Key Center for Exceptional Children that had opened just 2 months before, and felt that might be an avenue for me. I came here, and that was in 2009, in December of 2009, and brought my son. And at the time, the co-founder, Terry Frank, was the executive director and co-founder, and she took one look, and she calls herself the Grim Reaper because she does this often, and said, you need to most likely go to Children's, and you're most likely going to receive a diagnosis of autism. And okay, he can start here in January after Christmas. And so it did. And 6 months from that time, we were in Children's getting series of tests. And then my son was diagnosed. Back then, it was high functioning autism. Now it's based on level 1, 2, and 3, 1 being least impacted, 3 being most impacted. So he would be qualified level 1 now. But he is, so at that point, even before we waited for the doctor, my husband and I sat there and waited, and we said, well, if it's not autism, which we don't think it is because he's grown so much in 6 months just at this school, so we're probably going to be good. And they still said, and we're like, well, we're going to always give back, to the Golden Key. And at the time, it was just a childcare. And then then Terry opened it up for a kindergarten. And then after that, she expanded it to 3rd grade. And by the time he got to 3rd grade, we did decide to move him into the district. He was ready. And that's part of the Golden Key's mission always. If a student is ready to fly, we're going to send them on their way, no matter where they are in their chronological age and year here at the Golden Key, because we want them to succeed society-based. And so he did. He started in our school district, and he's been there ever since. But then that also led to me, as he made those transitions, there was a lot of more I had to still do, because I had to still educate the schools. I still had to do that. And then Terry was looking for a successor in her long-term plan of moving out to retire eventually. And that 6.5 years ago, I came on as the operations director, and my passion has been 100% consumed by the Golden Key, all driven by my family's passion to help those on the spectrum. And I always say every family that walks through this door is my family all over again. How can we help them? My husband's involved with me equally. My daughter volunteers and works every summer here. And it has led to a family passion. My son, he chuckles when he comes in because the building has morphed into what it is today, and it's completely different to what it was then, and says, that's not my school, but it is my school, so he still has an ownership to it just as much as I do. But it changed our lives, and we are blessed, I feel, in the community as a parent, that we have a resource such as the Golden Key that supports us in all types of ways. And I'm biased, obviously, but I am hopefully proof of the pudding as well, my family.
100%.
That's incredible. It's inspiring to see how passionate you are about making a difference.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Gina, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and opinions.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. You guys are doing wonderful things. I'm so proud of you all.
Yes, your insights today have given us quite a lot to think about and have definitely inspired us to keep advocating for a greater understanding of autism.
Yeah, and to our listeners, let's all commit to being more informed and more inclusive. Every small effort can make a big difference, and it's important that you guys make those efforts so that we can make our difference.
So with that, this wraps up the first episode of All Things Autism by Court One. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for episode 2. See you next time.